Good evening, children. The story I'm going to read today is called David's Party. David was playing in the garden and Dad was trying to cut the grass. Then he called David. David, will you go and telephone Mr. Small and ask him if I can borrow his garden shears, please? Asked Dad. All right, said David, and off he went into the house. Now, who did Dad want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was Mr. Tall. So he telephoned Mr. Tall and thought, what had Dad asked me to ask him to lend? If Dad could borrow your garden chairs. So instead of shears, he ordered for chairs. And instead of Mr. Small, he called up Mr. Tall. Why does your dad want to borrow my garden chairs? Asked Mr. Tall. I don't know. Perhaps we are going to have a party, said David. All right, said Mr. Tall. I'll bring the chairs. I'll bring the chairs around, but go and telephone Mr. Green and ask her, Mrs. Green, and ask her if you could borrow her table, because I don't have a table. So David went to look for the telephone number. Now, who did Mr. Tall want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was Mrs. Brown, he said. And he telephoned Mrs. Brown and asked her if Dad could borrow her stables. Instead of table, he asked for stables. Do you know what stables are? All right. Why does your dad want to borrow my stables? Asked Mrs. Brown. I don't know, said David. We are having a party and perhaps our garden is too small for a party. So can we borrow your stable, Mrs. Brown? All right, said Mrs. Brown. I'll get the stable ready, but go and telephone Mr. James and ask him for some big tablecloth. So David went to look for the telephone number. Now, who did Mrs. Brown want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was Mr. Jones. So he quickly dialed Mr. Jones' number and asked him if Dad could borrow some big plates and mops instead of tablecloth. See how forgetful he is. Why does your dad want to borrow my big plates and mops? Asked Mr. Jones. I don't know, said David. We are going to have a party and in Mrs. Brown's stable. Perhaps the plates are to put the food on and the mops are to mop the stable. All right, said Mr. Jones. I'll bring them around, but go and telephone Mr. Baker and ask him to bring some big bags. All right, said David, and he went to look for the telephone number. Now, who did Mr. Jones want me to telephone? He thought and he thought. Oh, yes, it was the baker. So he telephoned the baker and thought, what was he supposed to order? And he told him to bake some big buns. Hot cross buns, 1 a penny, 2 a penny, hot cross buns. Okay, we are going to have a party in Mrs. Brown's stable and Mr. Jones is going to bring some mops and plates. He said perhaps the buns are to go onto the plates. All right, said the baker, I'll bring the buns around. Now go and get ready for the party, David. So David went to get ready for the party. When he came down, Dad was waiting for him. What have you been doing, David? He asked. Mr. Tall has brought some chairs. Mrs. Brown has telephoned me to say that her stable is ready. Mr. Jones has brought some mops and plates. And the baker has brought lots and lots of buns. All I wanted was to cut my grass and wanted a small pair of shears from Mr. Small. So what do we do now? So David told Dad about his telephone calls and how he kept forgetting the numbers. Oh dear, said Dad. I wanted to do just that, but what shall we do now? I know, said David. Let's have a party after all. All right, said Dad. And they soon had a party and had lots of fun. Thank you.